NATO's chief dismisses a call from Italy to suspend operations in Libya and insists the mission will go on. But what's behind the Italian call, and does that signal cracks in NATO over Libya? This is Inside Story. Warm welcome to the programme. I'm Hazem Seeker. NATO's military strategy in Libya is to press on, but it appears cracks in the mission are beginning to show. A rise in the number of civilian deaths has called into question NATO's mission in the country, and on Wednesday, Italy's Foreign Minister Franco Frattini called for an end to hostilities in the country.
I believe that aside from a ceasefire, which would be the first step towards political negotiations, we need the suspension of armed activity in order for humanitarian corridors to be opened into the country.
But this was met with a swift dismissal from NATO's chief, Anders Fogh Rasmussen. In an interview with French newspaper Le Figaro, he said, "We will take the time needed until the military objective is reached. End all attacks against Libyan civilians, return armed forces to barracks, and freedom of movement for humanitarian aid." Well, joining me now to talk more about the implications of all this are our guests. In Benghazi, Jalal El-Galal, civilian spokesperson for the Media Committee for the National Transitional Council. That's a legislative body working on behalf of the Libyan people. In London, Shashank Joshi, associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Gentlemen, good to have you with us. Shashank Joshi, if I could start with you. Are we seeing some real cracks appearing in the NATO alliance here? And how successful do you think the international operation has been in Libya, notwithstanding that?
Well, first of all, let's look at its success. I think it's been extremely successful. It's degraded Gaddafi's ability to wage war on his own people. It's averted what would have been a likely massacre in Benghazi, but also other massacres elsewhere in the country. And it's ensured that the regime can no longer use its heavy equipment, its tanks, its artillery, its firepower against unarmed civilians or heavily populated areas. Now, how is it doing in its mission of regime change, which is, of course, its paramount mission here now at this point? Well, it's having mixed results. I think it will eventually win. I think Gaddafi's fall is an inevitability, but I think it could still take a couple of months. I don't think we're seeing a imminent collapse, as some people suggested. As for NATO, well, we're seeing splits re-emerge, not emerge for the first time. Italy was always a little bit schizophrenic about this mission. It was never fully in this. You're seeing concerns about this from other NATO countries, but in the end, I can assure you NATO will keep bombing. France and Britain have way too much invested in this mission to actually stop, and they will push this through. So concerns there will be, but France and Britain will push this to the end.
Jalal El-Galal in Benghazi, what's your view on this? Shashank Joshi saying in the long term this isn't a real cause for concern, but do you fear, or is there a fear among people in Benghazi about the commitment that these disagreements within NATO, which are now coming more into the open now, that this might affect the commitment to the military campaign to remove Gaddafi from power?
Well, I don't think we anticipate that there is a lack of commitment or relaxing of their commitment. I honestly believe that NATO is as committed as the Libyan people to finally get rid of the Gaddafi and his regime. Just to reiterate, if NATO did not step in, and if we can fast backward to the 19th of March, we would have had a Holocaust here in Benghazi. So NATO's actions are welcomed here, they're expected, and they hope that it will be continuous, relentless action in order to expedite the departure of Gaddafi. 2 months from now seems a long time for these people. And probably that's why some Libyans are saying, why are they not as concentrated or not as heavy? Because they can't wait for another 2 months, or they hope that it will be over much sooner than that.
Shashank Joshi, I just want to get back to the comments, some of the comments that Franco Frattini, the Italian foreign minister, made, and his suggestion or his call for a ceasefire with some type of humanitarian corridor to be allowed in. Now, we know that at this point, at least in the short term, that's probably unlikely. But if that were to happen, would that perhaps give Gaddafi's forces time to regroup in this conflict?
Well, it depends entirely how a ceasefire was actually implemented. First of all, it's difficult to imagine it would be obeyed by either side. The rebels would have every incentive to push on. I see it very unlikely that NATO would bomb them. The regime itself would break the ceasefire almost instantaneously, as it's done in the past. But even if it was implemented, it depends entirely where. The regime's not really going to be able to move forces on open roads from one place to the other without breaking the ceasefire. So, no, it probably couldn't regroup in that sense. What it might be able to do, though, is work at breaking the embargo, work at restoring fuel supplies into Tripoli, work at restoring the base of its war-making capacity. So I think there are some legitimate concerns about how a ceasefire might undo some of the hard work that NATO's done so far. Having said that, I think it's not an unreasonable suggestion that NATO think about civilians first and foremost, given the legal basis of their intervention is UN Resolution 1973, which is focused on the protection of civilians. And in this campaign, in the ongoing fighting, civilians are still getting caught up, even if this war is prosecuted in their name.
There have also been reports about this campaign, recent reports, some of them saying that NATO is running out of resources, that it's running out of strategic targets to go after, and that perhaps it would need to revise its strategy in some way. Do you agree with that?
Well, I disagree they need to revise their military strategy. I think that they have done reasonably well. I think it's correct to say the target set has shrunk in the sense that there are only so many times you can bomb Bab al-Azizia. There are only so many times you can bomb command and control hubs inside Tripoli. But they still have a number of targets outside of Tripoli as well. The rebels are, of course, pushing out from Misrata to the west. And I think it's very important NATO bears in mind Gaddafi forces around that area. I think it was yesterday they struck about 13 armoured vehicles in Zlitan. And so there are still targets of opportunity like that to strike. And as to whether NATO is running out of resources, well, it's suffering some strains. That's no surprise. Britain has cut its military capability enormously, and the United States is remaining on the sidelines. But it has enough to continue till the autumn, and it will find enough to continue beyond then if that's necessary. So the resource argument isn't really a meaningful constraint.
One of the things that also seems to be happening is that the NATO strategy appears to be focused more on Tripoli and at knocking out the nerve centre of the Gaddafi regime in the hope that some type of uprising will take place from inside the capital. Is that ultimately what needs to happen? And does that suggest to you that NATO has perhaps lost faith in the rebels' ability to gain any ground from the east?
Well, I think there was very little chance of the rebels moving from the east all the way to Tripoli in any case. I think NATO knew that from the beginning. It was assisting them to hold their ground. I don't think it was seriously assisting them with the belief they would function as some sort of spearhead force to move 500 miles westwards to Tripoli. I think NATO does still have some faith in the rebels in the west, particularly those who are able to do other things other than attack Tripoli itself. For example, rebels in the west have cut the oil pipeline that delivers oil to the refinery at Zawiya. I think that's an absolutely critical act, and one which will have very far-reaching consequences in Tripoli. And the rebels would not have been able to do that had they not had the breathing space afforded by NATO airstrikes. So it's not just a question of the rebels in Benghazi, it's a question of can the rebels put pressure on the regime at the same time as NATO engages in a campaign of punishment. And I think those things together will eventually mean an uprising will occur in Tripoli. And yes, I think that is the only way, the only realistic, meaningful way by which the regime falls, an uprising inside the capital city.
Jalal al-Galal, does this put more pressure on the rebels to achieve some type of breakthrough on the military front here?
Well, to be honest with you, the revolutionaries are doing their best. They have a lot of limitations in the sense that they don't have the armaments to counter what the Gaddafi forces have. However, we do believe that not a single factor will resolve this matter. It has to be a combination of factors: political isolation, economical isolation, the NATO campaign, which is paramount to the previous two, coupled with the Libyan people's aspirations and willingness to break free. If we combine all the factors, I am in total agreement that very soon the people in Tripoli will rise, because the situation there is reaching a crisis point. It's unbearable, as far as I hear from friends that manage to call me now and then from Tripoli. So we must maintain, though, the intensity of all of the factors in order to try to hasten the departure of Gaddafi, his family and his inner circle, or at least hasten the departure of his inner circle or the pillars of his regime, encourage desertion and defection, and hopefully things will collapse.
All right, let's take a step back for a moment and look at where we are in this mission at the moment, geographically speaking. We're now nearly 14 weeks into NATO's mission, and Gaddafi remains in power. While Benghazi might safely be in the hands of rebel forces, the fight is still on for the port city of Misrata. On Wednesday, NATO said it struck Zintan, taking out 13 armed vehicles, an armoured personnel carrier and a rocket launcher. And on Thursday, the military alliance conducted at least 47 airstrikes, with Tripoli also coming under fire. So, Jalal Galal, if I could turn back to you on this. The airstrikes, while they may have helped to some degree, and there is reported progress there, they're still not allowing your forces to push any further after 14 weeks, and the two sides now seem stuck on the battlefield. Isn't it time to be looking at some sort of a political solution here?
I'm not sure that there should be a political solution with Gaddafi or any member of his family involved. The man is indicted for war crimes. An arrest warrant could be issued any day for him. He's a war criminal. He carried atrocities against the Libyan people. So talking to him would basically reinstate legitimacy. And I don't think anybody has the authority to do that other than the families of the ones who have paid the ultimate price. I don't believe that the Libyan people feel that this is an option. I mean, any solution must include the departure of Gaddafi, his members of his family and his inner circle from Libya in the earliest possible time. Now, I beg to differ in the sense that it's a stalemate. I think Gaddafi is moving a lot of his forces to reinforce Brega, which is allowing us on other fronts to be able to make gains. Now, if NATO continues its relentless strikes, I think we will make inroads. As slow as that might seem, it's fluid. It is not static at all.
Shoshank Joshi, if I could turn back to you on this, the point that we were talking about a little bit earlier about the NATO campaign seemingly concentrated in Tripoli in the hopes of fomenting some type of internal uprising from within the capital. That's going to be fraught with risks, isn't it? I mean, relying basically on an underground opposition in Tripoli that you don't really know and you can't really see.
That's right, although of course we know that the rebels in the TNC are in contact with 100 or so underground rebels in Tripoli. So we have some sense that there is a loosely organised movement inside Tripoli. It's also almost certain to expand in size because the regime probably only has around 4 or 5 million barrels of oil. If its consumption even has maybe halved or has gone to a third of ordinary levels, that still only allows maybe 8 weeks of normal functioning, after which the lights go out, the factories stop running, the vehicles stop moving, and it's impossible to think that there would not form large amounts of opposition in the capital city. Now, having said that, I also just want to come back to this point about the viability or desirability of political negotiations. And I think it's important to recognise there's a difference between saying Gaddafi has to leave as any solution, which I think everyone accepts, and saying we cannot begin negotiating until Gaddafi leaves, which I think is a little more obstinate. I think negotiations can begin without conferring any legitimacy at all on Gaddafi and his family, and I think they may in fact be an important and useful way to avert a scenario in which Gaddafi turns Tripoli into a last stand and a siege. And it's a siege I don't think would be very, very easy or pleasant to break.
All right, let's put that to our man in Benghazi, Jalal al-Galal. I mean, does Gaddafi's removal have to be a precondition for any kind of talks here with the government? I mean, it's an ongoing process, so the end result could still lead to Gaddafi being removed.
Well, the point I'm trying to make is we cannot negotiate with a criminal. I mean, he has to stand for justice, either here in Libya or at the ICC or wherever, on any spot on earth. But the point I'm trying to make is, how can we be negotiating with him? We have no objection to a political solution that will have Gaddafi facing due process or leaving the country. There's no objection to that. But I can't visualize any Libyan accepting discussions with Gaddafi or any members of his regime that carried out such atrocities and such crimes against humanity. Honestly, I mean, you have to be a Libyan to understand my position. I mean, it's all very well for somebody from outside. Of course, we would like to put an end to the bloodshed. Of course, we try to minimize the costs, but not by talking to Gaddafi or any members of his immediate family or inner circle who have perpetrators of such crimes.
Shashank Joshi, you want to respond to that?
Well, let me just say I have enormous sympathy for the sentiments expressed there, and I certainly understand it's not for an outsider to make these comments and enforce them upon the opposition. I entirely understand that. All I will say is that we always talk to criminals. People around the world in conflicts always talk to criminals. We talk to those with blood on their hands. We talk to indicted war criminals. It's what happens when you have a conflict and there is a balance of power which does not favour one side overwhelmingly and decisively. Talking is not a sign of weakness. In fact, it's a sign of strength. Having said that, I do accept the idea that this is a matter of some emotion and concern for Libyans themselves.
There are some military analysts who have said, if I could stay with you on this, Shashank Joshi, that what ultimately is going to end this conflict is large numbers of boots on the ground. But in the current political climate, both in Europe and the United States, that simply isn't going to happen at this point. So where does that leave the military campaign at the moment?
Well, the military campaign has a single plank, and that is punishment. That is, it's what we call a compellence campaign. It seeks to compel Gaddafi to surrender. It's more about inflicting pain on the regime and strangulating it until it succeeds. That's what's going to happen. That's going to continue, and it's not really going to change. Boots on the ground are impossible. Impossible from a political point of view, from a military point of view. I can guarantee you it's not going to happen.
Sorry, let me just interject here. Why are they impossible from a military point of view?
Well, it's impossible from a military point of view because no military commander in any major armed forces, Britain, France, United States, is going to recommend to their superiors that a ground force would have any chance of success. All it would do is be stuck in a situation in which it would face prolonged guerrilla warfare from the remnants of Gaddafi forces. They would suffer great losses. They might or might not effect a major change, but I think there is no commander with any experience of Afghanistan or Iraq who would recommend moving a force into Libya, and for no other reason than the fact that it would be symbolically disastrous. Now, a peacekeeping force that is composed of multinational elements is a different thing, but there's absolutely no prospect of anyone with any influence or any say in Western countries advocating ground forces or getting their way on ground forces.
Jalal Galal, I want to get back to the point that Shashank Joshi was referring to a little bit earlier in the discussion about NATO's strategy being more focused on helping some type of uprising from within Tripoli. Is that ultimately what it's going to take to turn the tide in this conflict, and that it needs forces opposed to Gaddafi from the West, from inside Tripoli, to really tip the balance here?
Well, I agree totally with Joshua. I think that foreign forces, the sentiment here is exactly the same. It is an impossibility. I think that what we need, obviously, is for us to incite the people in Tripoli to rise, while at the same time making advances from the different fronts that are getting closer and closer to Tripoli. At the same time, I do believe that we are preparing what we call the Tripoli Task Force, and the longer this takes on, the readier this force is getting. And if we can get it as close as possible to Tripoli when the 0 hour arrives, I think we can have the situation under control. But definitely we all agree on the fact that the people in Tripoli have to rise to a large extent to assist all the other forces and basically make the final push.
And do you think that, do you have confidence that that will happen in the future as Gaddafi's forces get worn down more as this battle continues?
Without a doubt, I think NATO is doing a fantastic job. I think their continuity is a must in this formula. I think as time goes on, more and more of his troops are realizing that he's probably looking for a way out for himself, and therefore he's going to desert them, and therefore it is probably better for them to desert him beforehand. If we add all the other factors, as I said, I think not in the long distance future, but I would accept 2 months if you give it to me now. So in 2 months, I think that it will be curtains for Gaddafi, one way or the other.
Shoshank Joshi, isn't part of the problem and part of the lack of confidence that some people in Europe and the United States are having in the success of this campaign, perhaps that they had unrealistic goals to begin with? I mean, here we are 14 weeks into this conflict, and if you ask many people at the start of it whether this would still be going on, most people would say no.
That's right. I think this is a systematic feature of interventions anywhere. 11 years ago in Kosovo, people said, we will be done within weeks. Milosevic will give up within a couple of weeks. And it dragged on and dragged on and dragged on to 70-plus days. Once again, we went into Libya and people said, we are looking at days, not weeks. People said, we're looking at weeks, not months. So there is a chronic over-optimism that I think blights not just the politicians, but also NATO itself as an organisation. NATO is a chronically over-optimistic institution in Afghanistan and now, I think, in Libya. So we expect a city to fall every week. We expect a regime to collapse within weeks. And we should know better. We should know, having enforced a no-fly zone above Iraq in the 1990s, that Saddam Hussein hung on for 11 years. We know just how resilient that defiant, entrenched dictators can be if they have supplies of oil, if they have money to pay mercenaries, and if they have some loyal forces. Gaddafi had all of those. So there's no surprise at all it's taken this long. And I think NATO requires a little bit of patience.
Do you think perhaps as this conflict goes on and drags on for longer and longer, there is, of course, the issue of military budgets here, which are being strained. We've heard reports from Britain that the forces are being strained there, and from other governments in Europe as well. And in this period of economic austerity that we're in, both in Europe and in the United States, how much of an effect is that going to have as this conflict goes on longer and longer?
I think it has a very serious effect. I think we saw at the beginning of this conflict, Britain's Chancellor, George Osborne, said this mission will cost tens of millions of pounds. Now, last week we heard this mission would cost hundreds of millions of pounds, and only yesterday we had new estimates suggesting it may already have cost £250 million. Now, for those used to US defence budgets, this may not seem like very much money. But we have to remember, Britain is cutting enormous amounts of defence capabilities. In fact, it's cutting many of the things that are being used in Libya. For example, its Nimrod planes, its Sentinel reconnaissance planes, and some of the major ships that are being used. So for many serving personnel, for many senior defence bureaucrats, they look at this mission that's costing a couple of £100 million and they ask, is this strategic? Why are we spending a couple of £100 million here when we could have used this to avert some of the worst of the cuts we're also facing?
Just briefly, in the minute or so that we have left here, Jalal, if I could turn back to you on this for the final thought. I mean, where do you see all of this going forward? Do you think that there have been unrealistic goals for this campaign and Gaddafi was always going to fight to the death, and that this perhaps was going to take a lot longer than most people had anticipated?
Absolutely. There is no doubt there was, as Joshua said, there was chronic over-optimism. However, we have gone so far that the end is nearer than any time before. I think we still have to finalize this. We have to achieve the goal and the aim for the whole of the world, for the international community, but in particular for the Libyan people. It was always going to be difficult to remove a man who's been in power for 42 years, who has been calculating for 42 years, been calculating for this very particular moment. But we cannot stop now. We must finish the job. I think it is strategic. I think by the mere position of Libya geographically to Europe.
All right. Well, we will certainly be following all of the developments inside and outside of Libya. But that is all we have time for right now. I want to thank both of you for taking part in the discussion. Jalal Galal in Benghazi and Shoshank Joshi in London. Many thanks for your time. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.